Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Okay, everybody, it's 10:02. We've got a pretty packed agenda for today, so we'll hop right into it. I'd like to open by welcoming everybody to the CLRA Ontario chapter's first ever webinar. In light of COVID and needing to cancel the 2020 symposium field trip, we wanted to ensure that we were able to recognize our 2020 Tom Peters Memorial Mine Reclamation Industry Award winner, as well as the winners of the 2019 and 2020 Tom Peters Student Bursaries. Before we hear from Veronika, Robyn, and Jonathan, my fellow board members will be telling us a little bit about Tom Peters and his legacy, providing some information on the 2021 award nomination timeline, and announcing a new scholarship for this year. A couple of housekeeping points. Please ensure that you remain on mute while the presentations are taking place. There'll be time to ask questions after each presentation, so we ask that you use the hand raising function after the presentation is completed if you'd like to ask a question. We're also recording this webinar and it'll be available on our website. Now it's time for a shameless plug. The Ontario chapter is a nonprofit organization that relies on annual membership dues to help fund our initiatives. Individual memberships are only $80 per year, and if you're a student, your membership is free. By purchasing a membership, you're not only supporting us, but you're also ensuring that you will receive the notices for our upcoming series of webinars and help support the annual symposium and field trip when we can start gathering in person again. Please check out the Ontario chapter website to sign up. Now I'm going to hand it over to Brian Tish, Vice President of the Ontario chapter, to provide us with some background on Tom Peters and some important information for the 2021 awards. Give me 1 second, Brian. I'll make you presenter and you can take it away.
Good morning, everyone. As Adam said, my name is Brian Tish. I'm with Canmet Mining of Natural Resources Canada. And I'm delighted to highlight the contributions that Tom Peters has made to reclamation and the awards named in his honor. So a bit of background about Tom. Tom was a founding member of the Canadian Land Reclamation Association, which was established in 1975. And I think Leslie will touch a bit more on that under the Jack Winch Scholarship description. He was president of the association in 1981 and 1982, and then in 1984, he won the CLRA's prestigious Miranda Land Reclamation Award for outstanding achievement in the field of land reclamation. Tom graduated from the University of Guelph, which is where the CLRA was founded, in 1948. He moved to Coppercliff, Ontario, where he worked in the agricultural department of Inco Limited, now Vale, becoming their agriculturalist in 1973. Tom utilized his agricultural background from Guelph to assist Inco with their tailings revegetation and their overall land reclamation programs. He pioneered the use of agricultural practices in regreening mine tailings, including the basic recipes for the addition of limestone, fertilizer, seed, and the planting of fall rye as a cover crop. His work yielded excellent results on Inco's Coppercliff tailings, and his methods became the standard practice for mines all over the world. And in fact, Tom was called upon from companies all over the world to assist them. I was lucky enough to have known Tom when I was starting my own career some 30 years ago. And I fondly remember his very pleasant and helpful approach to students and young practitioners such as myself, along with his willingness to share his reclamation approaches and results. He was a well-respected and gifted leader for environmental causes and was internationally recognized in the field of land reclamation. He made major contributions to the City of Greater Sudbury Land Reclamation Program. He taught agricultural courses at the University of Guelph and Cambrian College, and contributed to reclamation courses at Laurentian University. He received an honorary doctorate from Laurentian for his outstanding leadership in regreening Sudbury. Tom retired in 1985, and in 1987, he became the first non-American to be named the Reclamationist of the Year by the American Society for Surface Mining and Reclamation. Following his death in 2007, the CLRA, in cooperation with the Ontario Mining Association, the Ontario Ministry of Energy, Northern Development and Mines, and Vale, established the Tom Peters Mine Reclamation Awards to recognize outstanding achievement in the practice of mine reclamation in Ontario. So just a bit about the awards. There are two awards that were established in 2011 in Tom's name. The first is the Tom Peters Memorial Mine Reclamation Industry Award, which was established to encourage the pursuit of excellence in mine reclamation and to recognize and promote to the mining industry and environmental community at large, outstanding achievement in the practice of mine reclamation in Ontario. Nominations can be made by companies, by individuals, or organizations with respect to either their own work or work completed by others. The award can be given for current activities or for past work, and is specifically targeted to the reclamation of mines normally regulated by the Ontario Ministry of Energy, Northern Development of Mines, and the Ontario Mining Act. Under the broad focus of mine reclamation, applications may relate to exploration, mine development, progressive rehabilitation or reclamation, and mine closure. The award consists of a plaque, which is added to duplicate trophies, with one trophy retained on display at the MENDM offices in Sudbury and the other at the OMA offices in Toronto. The winner is also presented with a keeper trophy that they can keep for themselves. So past winners have included Ministry of Energy, Northern Development of Mines for work at Camp Scotia, Vale, Gold Corp, now Newmont, Rio Algom, and a joint award with the Pinokian Hills Field Naturalists out of Elliott Lake, Agnico Eagle, Golder, Newmont, specifically for Walter Senza, TerraPure, and Kirkland Lake Gold, who were our winners in 2020, and we'll hear more about that one. So we've got a good broad range of companies that have been awarded this and recognized for the outstanding reclamation that they've been doing. So in recognition of Tom's commitment to students, an award was also developed to be presented to a master's or PhD level student who is undertaking reclamation-related research involving a mine site in Ontario. And that brings me to the second award, which is the Tom Peters Memorial Mine Reclamation Student Bursary. This one was established to encourage the pursuit of excellence in mine reclamation and to foster the training of highly qualified personnel in mining and the environment. This comes with a $5,000 award and was established for graduate students enrolled at a Canadian university but conducting Ontario-based reclamation research related to any aspect of the mining cycle, from advanced exploration to long-term monitoring. The cash award is generously provided by Vale and coordinated and administered by the Ontario chapter of the CLRA. I won't go into the significant details of the application process, but it includes a student statement letter, resume, transcripts, and a recommendation letter from their supervisor. Past winners have represented Laurentian University, McMaster University, University of Waterloo, Lakehead University, and the University of Toronto. So again, we've got fairly good distribution, but always happy to have submissions and hopefully winners from other universities as well. So this year's awards, the information has not gone out yet, but for your information, the application deadline for both awards, both the industry and the student award, is Friday, June 18th, 2021, so this June. It's normally time to go ahead of our mine reclamation symposium, but since we're not holding that this year, we've moved it from the deadline from May to a June deadline. So further information can be found on the CLRA website at www.clra.ca under the Ontario chapter, or by contacting myself or other members of the CLRA board. Thanks very much, and I encourage you to nominate yourselves and others. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian, for that background on the awards and the nominations for this year. Next, we're going to hear from Leslie Heimer, Secretary of the Ontario chapter, who's going to tell us about the new Memorial Scholarship for 2021. You're just on mute here.
On behalf of the board, to formally announce the new Dr. Jack Winch Memorial Scholarship. Some background about Jack. He was a reclamation scientist, a principal founder, and the inaugural president of the Canadian Land Reclamation Association. Jack Winch was born in the rural community of Paris, Ontario, in southwestern Ontario. I'm also from Paris. After serving in the Royal Canadian Air Force, Jack was employed by the Field Husbandry Department of the Ontario Agricultural College at the University of Guelph, where he would ultimately go on to earn a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture and a Master's of Scientific Agriculture. He received a PhD in agronomy from Cornell University and then joined the Faculty of Crop Science Department at the University of Guelph, where he taught crop and forage production and plant physiology to diploma, undergraduate, and graduate students for 28 years until his retirement in 1986. Jack's legacy includes significant contributions to the advancement of reclamation research, practice, and extension work, especially as they regarded the evaluation and introduction of birdfoot trefoil and crown vetch, which ultimately led to the broad use of these plants and the development of an Ontario trefoil industry for erosion control and livestock forage. Jack is also credited with developing a new in vitro method for the evaluation of forage crops and establishing a new forage crop cutting methodology. His extension work led him to rural communities across the province, where he established demonstration projects. His interest in agricultural development led to international work in Europe, Asia, and South America. Jack's work and reputation attracted graduate students to the Ontario Agricultural College from across Canada and around the world. Jack served a critical role in the direction of the land reclamation community in its early stages, acknowledging the need to establish a professional organization to support the burgeoning multidisciplinary field. Initially involved in the formation of the Ontario Cover Crops Committee in 1970 at the University of Guelph, he, along with other researchers and practitioners, went on to found the Canadian Land Reclamation Association in 1995, as Brian shared earlier. Jack was elected the inaugural president of CLRA and served a 3-year term. His leadership was instrumental to the development of the association's mandate and membership, and to the establishment of the annual meeting and the reclamation-focused periodical Canadian Reclamation, an initiative that has lasted for 45 years. The Dr. Jack Winch Memorial Scholarship was founded in 2020. In March of 2020, Dr. Winch passed away in his 100th year. This scholarship was created in celebration of his life's work and his legacy and memory by his children, and will be administered by the Ontario chapter of the Canadian Land Reclamation Association. The scholarship will be presented annually to a post-secondary student in recognition of their outstanding contribution to reclamation research and practice, including landowner engagement. The scholarship is valued at $3,000 and will be presented to the recipient at the Ontario Annual Mine Reclamation Symposium and Field Trip. It is our intent that the inaugural scholarship will be presented in 2021, even in the absence of a reclamation symposium and field trip in-person event. Qualifications and application criteria. Applicants must be enrolled as a full-time senior undergraduate or graduate student in a Canadian university or college at the time of the application submission. The research must also be an Ontario-based project. Applicants are encouraged to present their research findings at the annual Mine Reclamation Symposium and Field Trip, and it would be excellent if you could take guests to where you conducted your fieldwork. Requirement for a student CLRA membership is not required, but it is strongly encouraged. And unfortunately, you can only win this scholarship once. The application process is quite easily prescribed. There's 4 things that you need to provide: a letter of intent, a resume, transcripts, and a letter of recommendation from your project supervisor. Details about those things in particular are available on the website. And we have decided this year that the application deadline will be the same as Tom Peters, so Friday, June 18th, but it will vary each year depending on the date of the Reclamation Symposium and Field Trip. And again, for further information, please visit the Ontario chapter website or reach out to a member of the board of directors of the Ontario chapter, and we would be happy to provide more information. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Leslie. We're very excited to be able to work with the Jack Winch family and providing the scholarship moving forward. Now we're excited to hear from our 2020 Tom Peters Memorial Mine Reclamation Industry Award winner, Kirkland Lake Gold, for their project at the Detour Lake Mine. Veronika Raizman is the manager of reclamation and geochemistry with KL Gold and is a professional geoscientist with 10 years of laboratory and field experience in environmental science, geochemistry, and microbiology. She holds a PhD in earth sciences from the University of Toronto. Her work in the mining industry focuses on planning and execution of mine reclamation and the prediction and management of metal leaching and acid rock drainage during all phases of the mining cycle, as well as mine waste characterization using static, kinetic, and field testing programs. Thank you for joining us, Veronika, and take it away.
Thank you very much for the introduction, the honor of this award, and for having me on as a panelist. As mentioned, I take care of the geochemistry and closure programs for Kirkland Lake Gold. We have a number of operating mines in Canada and Australia, but today I'll be focusing on the Detour Lake mine. This is our largest and most long-lived asset, where a significant portion of our R&D efforts are taking place. So in this presentation, I'll walk you through the operational incentives for planning closure early on in mine life, and give you a broad overview of our research and progressive reclamation programs. So let's start with an overview of the Detour Lake mine. It's located in northern Ontario, approximately 140 kilometers north of the town of Cochrane. The project is built on top of the former Placer Dome mine, which operated a small open pit and underground gold mine, except on a scale that's much less than ours. Our open pit is sitting on top of it, but is much bigger, with about a 3-kilometer strike that you can see here, if you're able to see my cursor. And then two additional pits are planned with the West Detour expansion that will be coming online in the next few years. We have about 20 to 30 years remaining on the life of mine plan, so lots of time to plan for closure and execute progressive reclamation, but also a lot of area to cover, as you can see. So we're removing about 100,000 tons per day out of the pit, and up to 32 million of that is processed through the mill each year. Our waste materials that aren't ore are segregated according to their acid rock drainage potential. So non-acid generating materials are stored in this southern stockpile named MRS2, and potentially acid generating materials are stored in this northern stockpile. And that's done for both mine wastewater segregation reasons, as well as some favorable topography underneath these two features. We also have 3 tailing cells. You can see 2 of them have been built in this area, and one of them 10 years. These 2 will actually be closed during active operations. So that's a very exciting opportunity to learn how to do these things progressively and make sure we de-risk final closure. We are blessed with abundant reclamation material in the form of mineral till and peat, and that's being stripped from the footprint of the open pits as well as the 2 new pits that I mentioned. So why is closure an operational driver? Until recently, closure has been a secondary consideration or not a consideration at all for some mining proponents, but fortunately for both legal and ethical reasons, views are shifting and closure is becoming more of a priority. But there are still a lot of issues, such as very conceptual closure plans without a lot of ground truthing, poor record of integrating proof of concept research and progressive reclamation activities into mine plans, deferring work, and short-term operational decisions that have long-term implications for closure. In short, it leaves a lot of room for risk and doubt as to whether closure can actually be executed as planned. So at KL, we take the approach that closure is an essential operation component from the beginning, for a number of reasons, on top of it being the right thing to do. So the first kind of umbrella is the regulatory and social license. So we live in a complex permitting environment, particularly in Canada and Ontario, but also because it's a very large mine, it receives a proportional amount of attention in that way. So our ability to continue the operation and developing those expansions that I mentioned are very hinged upon maintaining positive collaborative relationships with both government and the Indigenous communities that we're partnered with. From a technical point of view, in order to actually execute the project as planned, we have to build these stockpiles out to their final limits and reclaim as we're going up. Otherwise, we're actually going to lose access to all of those faces, slopes, and benches that we need to reclaim, because the access will become too narrow for the large equipment that's involved in reclamation processes such as grading, placing the soil covers, and installing drainage features that are going to reduce erosion at closure and allow us to manage the water adequately. So because of that, we've actually incorporated progressive reclamations as an annual activity in our overall life of mine plan for all of our years going forward. But this process has to start with having a goal in mind. So how do we get those objectives for closure? So Detour Lake Mine, we have detailed plans for both water and land management during mine life and post-closure. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'll be focusing on the terrestrial component. So one of the first steps in our process was to develop an end land use plan. This involved, first of all, creating a map of all the ecosystems that existed before the construction of the mine site. Then we went out to our partnered Indigenous communities and held workshops and surveys to inform them about how closure goes typically and help get their opinion on what closure objectives should be. So what kind of end land uses do they want to see? What plant and animal species are important to them? And the three things that we got out of those in general were people want to see that the environment is returning to its pre-development state as much as possible, with the understanding that some changes are more permanent. For example, this is a very muskeg, lowland, wet dominated environment, but we're building these large rock stockpiles that are going to be a much more upland and dry environment, but we can still restore it to a natural analog that happens to be that sort of forest. They also were very focused on habitat for native species naturally, and particularly caribou. So a lot of our revegetation plans are geared towards the type of environment that caribou prefer. So these closed canopy, black spruce forests, lots of lichen, but not so much the species that tend to attract other species such as moose, which then in turn attract more predators, which may have harmful effects on the on caribou. And then of course the land must be safe and available for both traditional and economic use. So from those goals, as well as the previous ecosystems that existed, what we did was we modeled the future ecotypes that could potentially be created based on the soil conditions, the climate, the surrounding vegetations, and all of those considerations from the community. And this is kind of the map we came up with. And that sets the kind of vegetation that we're hoping to achieve post-closure. So how do we get there? The answer is the progressive research program. So with this, we can increase our certainty that what we've promised can be delivered and develop the methods that we need in order to achieve that. It also provides really important information on costing so that our bond is accurate and what's in the life of mine plan in terms of our costing is accurate. And it creates business and capacity building opportunities for our partnered Indigenous communities because a lot of the work won't be executed by our mine fleets, particularly in terms of the revegetation aspect, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. So we actually initiated this program in 2012 before the mine was even running, and it's continued to evolve since. There's about 10 distinct projects under our research umbrella, but I'll just focus on the top 4 for terrestrial restoration for the sake of this presentation. And those are the restoration of lichen and soil biological crusts, pilot scale revegetation with native species, our full-scale test cover program, and the revegetation of tailings. So lichen and biological soil crust. To refresh you on what that is, so this is encompassing a large community of small plant and microbe species that interact at the soil surface layer, and they contribute to the stability, fertility, and ability of a soil to establish other plants. So when you have these guys going, they're an important primary colonizer, and they can assist with the recovery and natural succession of a system. They're also, in terms of lichen, a preferred forage for caribou, which we mentioned as a cornerstone species for our reclamation and restoration efforts. For between 2015 and 2017, we conducted transplant studies on site where we planted lichen mats on disturbed mine surfaces of various types. So first of all, it's that till material that I mentioned as our main source for coverage. And unfortunately, we found that the lichen were not very viable on that terrain. And we think it's probably due to poor drainage and siltation, but they were pretty good at being viable, establishing and growing on coarse gravel and rock. So any of those roadways around site and potentially even the mine rock stockpiles might serve as future growth media for the lichen and the biological soil crusts, and then lead to much longer down the road a more robust ecosystem. So this research has continued. Since those field trials, we've sampled and curated a list of dominant species, both on the Detour site and other sites that were naturally colonizing disturbed areas, and have moved on to testing those in the lab and greenhouse. So the first is this pilot scale trial, where we just tested whether fertilizer actually enhances crust development and species diversity. Unsurprisingly, it does. This was then scaled up to a greenhouse trial where we're testing various lichen propagation methods using a variety of growth media, including the mine till again, but this time with amendments. And the key question here is, can we do something like hydroseeding with lichen, or can we transplant lichen that are grown at a commercial scale and help mine restoration that way? Because traditionally, these are so slow growing that it's hard to even tell whether they're dead or alive. So we're trying to answer that question because it's not something that's received a lot of attention in reclamation, but could be potentially extremely useful, especially from the caribou forage point of view. There's also a multi-site corona sequencing project going on where they're basically analyzing how biological soil crust communities evolve over time and what kind of implications that might have for planning restoration timelines. So out of all the research streams that I'm going to talk about today, this is probably our most shoot for the moon style project. But from here on, I'll move into our very applied, very practical research programs that are already beginning to be scaled up to actual mine restoration scale. So the first one that we started in 2015 was this vegetation, soil health, and amendment trial. So this is one of our camps on site, and you can see part of the mine infrastructure in the background. And we created a pile of till, very similar to the covers that we're going to use, and created all of these different test plots that test various conditions. And you can see all the different amendments here. So we have control plots, fertilizer, winter kill crops, combinations of peat, biosolid, fertilizer, and all of these different native species that are available in the area, both in terms of trees, shrubs, and grasses. And we see how they did. So what we're considering here is how well native plants establish and grow on the media that we have available, how the soil chemistry, temperature, and moisture evolves, what nutrients are available to the plants over time. And then there was also this really exciting metagenomics component where we measured the bacterial and fungal communities in these plots and compared them to reference plots. So what we're trying to see is, from that soil microbiome point of view, which systems are tending towards a more natural system and which are continuing to show signs of disturbance. And that might give you some indication of how stable these communities are going to be in the long term. So what we largely found was certain treatments like one-time applications of winter kill oats biosolids were not as effective for promoting species richness and overall coverage. Fertilizer alone worked really well, as you might be able to see from these columns here in the Simpson's Diversity Index, but we found that they actually favored grass growth at the expense of tree species. And I'll touch on this a little bit later on again. Or actually, let me just talk about it now. So for the permaplacer dome mine, they also had to do a large amount of reclamation for the piles of waste rock that they left behind. And what they did was they used a very typical treatment, which is hydroseeding with an aggressive agronomic grass mix. And we actually touched on this a little bit earlier on with the bird's foot trefoil and the vetches. Those are really great for greening and controlling erosion, but one of the grievances we had with this approach is that it makes it difficult to reestablish those ecotypes that we featured in the end land use plan earlier on, because they're such aggressive and strong competitors. So we have some historical reclamation on the site from Placer Dome where these mixes were used, where we still don't have a single tree or shrub that has managed to colonize the area. So our big goal was to restore the native ecotypes that used to occupy this mining space, and that's why we endeavored for this particular research. So the best performance that we found was a blend of peat and fertilizer, so that's fortunate. Peat could also be any other organic amendment, but we happen to have peat available on site. So that makes it more efficient for us to use, and it does have the advantage of sometimes carrying propagules from other species that might enrich that community. We also found that these plots were receiving quite a bit of seed rain from the surrounding environment, and the species richness was increasing quite a bit that way as well for the plots that are well set up to receive those. And on top of that, we found that the soil chemistry and microbiome profiles for the peat and fertilizer or biosolids plots were tending towards the reference site. So they were looking more natural as time went on, where some of the other treatments still looked like they were before and the microbiome was kind of all over the place. So on this basis, when we went to full-scale reclamation, which is what I'll talk about next, we were really focused on using this peat and fertilizer combo. So in terms of the full scale, like I had mentioned before, we have a lot of land to cover, and we need to figure out whether these findings translate to hundreds of hectares and still produce stable ecosystems that are going to stand the test of time. So we devoted about 10 hectares of the North stockpile that I showed you earlier. So it's a nice large chunk, and this is being conserved throughout life of mine now, so we can study it. And it considers the ecological aspects that we talked about, but it also brings in all of the geotechnical components. So it considers different slopes, like how much do we have to grade our stockpiles? How thick does the cover have to be? What kind of surface treatment that can we apply in order to promote plant growth? Because if you just place a dense soil cover, it's possible you won't even have root penetration. So are you going to need corrugation or microtopography or ripping? What do you need to do to that surface? The aspect, so whether it's facing north or west or south, that can have a difference in terms of insulation and even the amount of wind and precipitation that is being received just because of the scale of these landforms, the peat content of the soil, what you're seeding and when, and hydrological parameters, because managing water is going to be our biggest post-closure problem and liability. On top of that, these are also instrumented quite rigorously. So this is a little map of all the instruments we have. So we're monitoring temperature, moisture, and gas as it goes through the cover and into the waste rock. And we have several piezometers that actually extend into the bedrock underneath the stockpile. So that should give us the best idea we can get of any in situ metal leaching and acid rock drainage processes that are happening through time. And it's one of the goals of these covers is to be able to control MLRD to some extent by limiting the ingress of oxygen and water. And there's also a central weather station on top of that. So basically all the data collection that we could pack into 10 hectares is what we did here. So just some early fun results from last year. Like I mentioned, this has really only had one full season of growth, and we're looking forward to more results this summer. But what we found is for most of the treatments, there's some erosion and rill formation, but no major failures, even in the plots that had a 2-to-1 slope, so very steep. Lots of erosion there, but no slumping or anything like that. We also found it interesting that the till seems to have some self-armoring properties. Well, what I mean by that is the finer material will erode, but there's enough cobble and rock that it essentially forms these little rock channels on the surface and protects all of the material underneath. So it doesn't eat all the way into the waste rock that's being covered. And in some spots, it looks like the vegetation was actually preferring locations near those rills because that's where water was being conducted. So that was quite interesting. Microtopography surface treatment had the best performance in terms of both stabilizing the covers to prevent erosion and revegetation. What I mean by microtopography is it's basically this bumpy surface, very heterogeneous, and that makes sense because it looks the most like the natural environment. The native grasses and deciduous trees perform best from a biological point of view. We had some mixed results for the coniferous species, and we do think that's because they will need a more mature soil, but certain species like tamarack.
I think we lost Veronika. Sorry, everybody, just bear with us for a second, and we'll see if we can get Veronika back on. Maybe what we'll do, Robyn, I'm going to put you on the spot, and maybe we can move on to your presentation, and we'll come back around, and once Veronika gets those connection issues figured out, we can jump in back to her. So, as has been the tradition, we asked the Tom Peters Student Bursary winner to present at the annual symposium and field trip. Unfortunately, with the impacts of COVID-19 last year, we were unable to hold the 2020 symposium, but we were not about to let our 2019 Student Bursary winner, Robyn Rumney, get off that easy. Robyn is currently working as research project manager for the LCARE project at Laurentian University. She completed her MSc biology degree at Laurentian in 2020, studying the effects of tree planting and soil amendments on carbon storage in Sudbury. Robyn's research interests involve determining how to best manage landscape restoration to maximize carbon storage and other ecosystem services. She will be talking to us about the effects of restoration on carbon storage and smelter-impacted industrial barrens. The floor is yours, Robyn.
Thank you, Adam. Are you able to see my presentation?
Yeah. Now it's gone back to, it's just the actual, there you go. That's the one.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks again, Adam, for that great introduction. As you mentioned, my name is Robyn Rumney. And I was very thankful to win the Tom Peters Student Bursary Award in 2019, and I'm excited to share some of the findings that have come out from the research since then. So I'm looking at the effects of restoration on carbon storage in smelter-impacted industrial barrens. As Adam mentioned, I'm now a research project manager for the LCARE project, and this is the same project that my master's research was done under. So the LCARE project is looking to develop ecosystem management protocols for carbon sequestration and habitat use. So the LCARE project in my research was based in the city of Greater Sudbury. As many of you know, Sudbury is a hard rock mining city with centuries of mining history. So it's the home of large copper and nickel deposits. And at its peak in the 1960s, there were 3 copper and nickel smelters in the city. These smelters, combined with open roast yards, large-scale fumigation from this, deforestation, and even fires, led to large areas of barren and semi-barren zones in and around the city. These barren areas have lost a lot of soil and vegetation, and in some areas are basically just completely rock. Starting in the 1960s, the city realized that something needed to be done about this. So they started off by dramatically reducing emissions. So in the 1960s, the super stack was erected, and with this, a large drop in emissions began. So compared to the peak sulfur dioxide emissions in the 1960s, we've decreased emissions by over 99% to date. So this has been paired with in the air and on the ground landscape reclamation. Starting in 1978, large areas were aerially limed with limestone, as well areas were hand limed, and nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium fertilizer was applied. And some areas were seeded with grass and legume seeds. A variety of trees have been planted over the area. And even most recently, there's been understory transplantations by taking areas of understory from outside the city limits and bringing them in to reintroduce the understory. So this reclamation has been a great challenge for the city of Sudbury. These barren areas within the red zones that the arrows are pointing to surround the 3 historic smelters, and these areas are completely barren with little to no vegetation. The black area, the black ring, encircles the semi-barren area where there's some vegetation and soil, but there's still been quite a bit of loss. So the goal for the city was to revegetate or regreen as much of this barren and semi-barren area as possible, excluding obviously the areas where housing developments and industrial complexes are and lakes. So the city's been very successful to date. And this is a snapshot from the City of Greater Sudbury Regreening app, which shows which landscape reclamation techniques have been applied where across the landscape. And to date, about 50% of the end goal reclamation has been done. So it's been a highly successful program that's ongoing. Reforestation at this large of a scale has an additional benefit. Reforestation is what's known as a natural climate mitigation pathway. A paper by Griscombe et al. In 2017 that was published in Nature outlined reforestation as the #1 natural climate solution in terms of sequestering carbon from the atmosphere into the forest components, and in doing so potentially mitigating climate change. It's very important to remember that natural climate solutions are only possible if they are paired with dramatic ecosystem or emission reductions. So they don't work on their own, but if we can reduce emissions and reforest large areas of the world, we have the potential to keep our global climate increase from not going above 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So this leads into the goal of our research, was to assess how these different restoration treatments around the city of Greater Sudbury have affected carbon storage. For the purposes of our research, we chose 4 restoration treatments. The first treatment was untreated areas that were just subject to this dramatic emission reduction, and in doing so, some regreening has occurred. The second treatment is a combination of dolomitic limestone, a nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium fertilizer, and grass and legume seed for the understory. The third treatment was tree planting, in this case jack pine, that was planted about 20 years prior to our study. And the final treatment was a combination of liming, fertilizing, and understory seeding with jack pine treatment, tree planting, also done about 20 years prior. So to answer our questions, we set up 32 field plots in the Daisy Lake watershed, which is within the barren zone just outside of the historic Coniston smelter, which closed in the 1960s. So this area is one of the most barren areas within the city, but since the smelter's closure, it started to regreen a bit. Another benefit of setting up our plots in this area is we have all of our treatments within a relatively small spatial area, which reduces any confounding variables, at least to some degree. So on each of these 32 plots, we did a comprehensive carbon survey. So starting with tree carbon, we measured all of the trees within each plot by measuring the diameter at breast height, the tree species, and whether it was alive or dead, what decay class it was. We then were able to use the Canadian Forest Service tree carbon equations and calculate the amount of carbon stored within each tree, both above and below ground. We then measured the understory carbon within each plot by setting up 4 subplots in the corners of the plots, and then harvesting both the herb and shrub layers at the forest floor. We cut them off and then we brought them back to the lab in bags where we dried them and then weighed them. And the dry weight was able to be used to calculate the carbon both above and below ground. So another large carbon pool that we measured was soil carbon. For this, we measured 8 different points per plot, and we sampled both the mineral soil and the forest floor, which is both the undecomposed and partially decomposed leaf litter. For both of these layers, we used the loss on ignition protocol, where we burned the soil at high temperatures and then calculated the amount of weight lost, and in doing so, the amount of carbon stored across these plots within the soil. The last carbon pools that we looked at were the downed woody debris. For this, we measured both the coarse and the fine woody debris, and we measured the volume of each piece within the site, and as well the decay class, so how far along it was in the decay process. And in doing so, this allowed us to calculate the carbon stored within all of the pieces. So one of the first results we looked at was tree carbon. And right off the bat, we saw some positive results. So when we calculated the amount of carbon stored per individual tree for our two predominant species, jack pine and white birch, we noticed some interesting results. So for jack pine, so this is our planted species, when we tree plant only without any soil amendments, each jack pine tree is storing on average just over 15 kilograms of carbon. When we add the soil amendments, so the lime, fertilize, and the understory seed, each jack pine tree is able to store just under 25 kilograms of carbon per tree. This is telling us that our soil amendments are doing what we had planned in terms of neutralizing the acidity in the soil and also potentially some of the trace metals in the system. When we look at the white birch trees, which is the predominant unplanted species, we see a similar trend where the untreated birch store about just over 2 kilograms of carbon per tree, but when we add lime, fertilize, and seed, they store about 3.5 kilograms of carbon per tree. So this is another significant increase, telling us once again that the white birch also grows larger and faster when we amend the soil. The effect starts to drop off when we add tree planting for white birch, probably just due to some competition between white birch and the planted jack pine. When we scale up the tree carbon to across the plots, we see again some positive results. So when we tree plant only, we see significantly more tree carbon than if we leave the areas untreated or just lime, fertilize, and seed. And once again, if we lime, fertilize, seed in complement with tree planting, we see significantly more carbon in the trees than if we tree plant alone. So this is just once again telling us that these soil amendments are helping the conditions for tree growth. And again, that by tree planting, even without the soil amendments, we're still manually accelerating the regreening of these sites and increasing the tree carbon stocks. When we looked at tree species richness between treatments, we also saw some benefits. So in the untreated sites, white birch was dominant, and there's extremely low species richness. So in some sites, just white birch, and some sites, maybe 2 or 3 species such as red maple and red oak as well. However, when we do the lime, fertilize, and seeding on top of the tree planting, we start to see jack pine and white birch are co-dominant, with jack pine being the most highly present tree, but we do see relatively higher species richness. So in some of these sites, we see upwards of 7 or 8 species, and across all of this treatment, we see a total of 13 species, which is well above the white birch dominant untreated plots. When we calculated the amount of downed woody debris per site, we found something we weren't quite expecting. So in an undisturbed forest in this region, you'd expect around 20% of the total carbon storage to be in downed woody debris, looking like the photo on the right with large downed trees and limbs. However, in these Sudbury impacted sites, we found that less than 1% of total carbon was in downed woody debris. So the downed woody debris we found was very small in general, and often petrified wood that was left from before deforestation. So we would expect that as the forest begins to develop and have trees die off and limbs fall, this carbon pool would begin to reestablish. So I expect that if we went back out to do this work in another 20 years or 20 years again after that, we would start to see our downed woody debris carbon pool be more representative of the 20% range. Soil carbon was also an interesting finding in our study. So in general, you expect that soil carbon is the largest carbon pool in this type of forest area, and our sites were no exception. So the majority of carbon in our sites were within the soil organic carbon layer. However, we didn't see any significant difference in soil organic carbon, no matter what metric we use to measure it among our treatments. You might notice that we have quite high variation in some of these sites as well. So in the last 100 years or so, it's predicted that around 1 meter of soil has been lost from some of these upland sites. So the stump photo on the left shows the extent of soil erosion in these upland barren areas. And this level of soil erosion and soil movement will take more than 40 years of regreening or 20 years of tree planting in the study's case to reestablish. So we're just not seeing any significant difference from treatment at this point. As well, the photo on the right was one of our study sites, and you can see that any even small hilly upland area will be bare of soil, and then the accompanying valley right beside it, or little micro divot, will have all the soil from the area. So I think this accounts for a lot of that high variability we saw, just because where you measure meter to meter can really change how much soil organic carbon there is on these sites. So when we summed up all of the carbon pools to look at the total carbon storage across these treatments, we didn't see any effect of restoration treatment. This, I expect, is because of the lack of effect of soil organic carbon, which I mentioned is the largest carbon pool across all the treatments. And again, we see that high variability, just showing how this microtopography on this landscape can really affect the amount of carbon, even meter to meter. When you look at so this is a photo taken within the city itself, but if you look at this photo from 1981, and then again in 2018, you can see a dramatic difference from 30 years. So you can see a large number of trees have come up on this landscape, whether planted or natural, bringing with it a significant amount of tree carbon storage on the landscape. And with this tree carbon storage, we not only have carbon sequestration from the atmosphere, but we have other ecosystem benefits. We have increased hiking and trail use from Sudburians. We also have increased wildlife habitat, biodiversity, flood mitigation, and many other benefits. So trees are definitely a strong metric of ecosystem and human health in a landscape, so it's important to keep bringing these trees back. But if you look at the soil, you might notice that there isn't much, if any, in that photo. So this soil organic carbon will take longer than 40 years to come back, especially in these rocky upland slopes. And this means that we don't have a significant increase in total carbon storage in the Sudbury landscape, at least in these upland barrens, yet. So in conclusion, planted tree carbon was increased 1.5 times when soil amendments were added to the sites. However, total carbon was unaffected. Tree planting within the city costs about $3,500 per hectare. This is the city's rates that include wages. And when we add liming, fertilizing, and seeding to this, it's an additional $17,000 per hectare. So the price increases dramatically. However, we have to remember that amendments do increase the amount of tree carbon on the sites, and as well our tree species richness and potentially other ecosystem services do benefit from these soil amendments. So when we're choosing restoration treatments for the landscape, it's important to lay out what our ecosystem goals are for the area, whether it be carbon storage or beyond, and to also do a cost-benefit analysis to make sure that we can do the larger this restoration on whatever large of a scale is needed. If you're looking for any more information on this research, we recently published it in Forest Ecology and Management. And if you're looking for a copy of this manuscript, please reach out to me and I'll be happy to provide it to you. Thanks so much for listening, and also thank you to the entire ELCARE team, our partners, and our funding agencies, especially the CLRA and the Tom Peters Bursary Award. Thank you.
Thanks, Robyn. We have a few minutes for questions for Robyn. If I just ask that you virtually raise your hand, I'm going to unmute all participants at this point. And if you have any questions, please, for Robyn, please let us know. I'm seeing no hands, so please feel free to come off mute and ask your question. looks like you might get off easy, Robyn.
That's fine by me. Well, thank you so much, everyone, if there are no questions.
Oh, we have one.
I just wanted to say great presentation.
Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions, comments? Perfect. Thanks, Robyn.
Brian Tish says he can't unmute.
Oh, that's probably because I'm muted. You should be able to now, Brian. No. Now you're self-muted. You're good. You just have to unmute yourself. No, I still have you muted.
I also see that Bill Keller has his hand raised.
Can you hear me, Robyn? It's Bill.
Yeah.
Well, it's just a simple question, but you did show how the carbon per tree increased with treatments. Presumably, that's just a function of the trees are bigger?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
I believe that's it. So they're just growing larger faster. I'm not sure how this would level out once they've reached full height. They're only about 20 years old so far.
Right. Thanks.
Hi, it's Brian. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
I'm not sure why I couldn't get it to unmute there. I was just wondering, when you look at the, just saying the, oh, sorry, I lost my question now. What I was thinking about was when you're considering the addition of lime and fertilizer, and you're getting added carbon storage, there's also a greenhouse gas cost to producing lime and fertilizer, and whether you account for any of that in your calculations.
That's a really great question. We haven't accounted for it, but I think that's a great point, that it's worth doing in the cost benefit analysis, the total life cycle carbon of these treatments, and especially with aerial liming and fertilizing, just including that airplane, it might not be worth it with the tree still growing and storing more carbon just with tree planting alone.
Yeah, it's interesting because lime has a huge greenhouse gas production cost, right? So, yeah, it's a very good presentation. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Catherine, you should be able to unmute yourself now and ask the question.
Oh, great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Great presentation. Thank you. I'm curious about reclamation success criteria and beyond sort of just soil and vegetation characteristics. And have you been looking at how soil organic carbon in the reclamation versus the undisturbed site could provide a measure of or a metric for success?
That's a great question. So we did look at soil organic carbon, not just in terms of storage, but in terms of carbon concentration between the treatments. And we didn't see any significant differences there as well, I think just due to that high variability again. But it would be worth doing further work in this just in terms of the other benefits that soil organic carbon could have for the landscape and for continued regreening, but it's not something we looked at in the study.
Thank you.
Jeff Bain, you should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Robyn. Good presentation. Blueberries are somewhat of a cash crop in Sudbury. Did you take note on how the blueberry crop is doing with the progressive kind of reclamation that's going on in Sudbury?
Yeah, well, I can say that the site I have has a very healthy blueberry crop. It was made fieldwork way more fun. And the untreated sites had far more blueberries than the treated in this case. So I think it's just because when you tree plant and even lime and fertilize and seed, it brings in a competition from the overstory and even understory. So if you're looking at it from a blueberry economic position, leaving it untreated is probably better for blueberry crop, just because blueberry is the dominant species in a lot of these rocky uplands. But I'm not sure what will happen as trees start to naturally come back in. I'm sure there'll still be some blueberries, but they might start to be less dominant.
Were like, are blueberries more hosted in the first place in these kind of harmed areas as opposed to just outside of like your black ring? Do you know?
I'm not sure exactly, but I think it might increase the crop just because there's no trees, there's no competition. The main understory or the main vegetation in some of these sites really just is blueberries. So I imagine if those trees hadn't been removed, there would be some competition and there might be less blueberries.
Okay, I see. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. We've got 2 more questions. Amy Heidman, you should be able to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, I just wanted to mention that there was an article in Nature just, I think yesterday, noting that there is a trade-off in carbon storage between trees and plants when you increase CO2. And I wondered if your research could speak to that. If it doesn't, that's fine.
So do you mean in terms of competition between the overstory and the understory, or that when there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, trees potentially could grow faster?
When there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, they found that trees will take it up more, or the soil will take it up, but not both. It seems that the trees are mining the carbon in the soil, which you wouldn't instinctively think of, perhaps.
Right.
But you don't get both increasing at the same time.
Right. That's an interesting point. I didn't look into that specifically, especially because we were just looking at a single time point. So there are other studies that in Sudbury that have looked at the increase in carbon in the different carbon pools through time. So that might be able to better address that. But I do know that there have been studies that do show that when you have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the trees take it up more, but obviously there's other detrimental effects to trees. But that would be a good follow-up study.
Thanks.
All right, time for one more question. Sanjay, you should be able to unmute and ask. Just going to send in a mute request, and there we go.
Yeah. So my question is, as this is an old smelter site, so did you thought about the heavy metals, and if yes, how you compensated that? And did you try to see whether trees are taking them up? Or if it is a thing like blueberry, then is it okay to consume them? So that component of the study.
Yeah, no, great question. So we did look at the metals. I didn't include it in this presentation just to keep things brief. But if you're looking for more, our manuscript does include that. But we didn't find any consistent results with the metals. And we only looked in the soils for this study. So we didn't find any consistent results on how the restoration treatments impact metals. But there are high metal loads, at least total metal loads on these sites, especially things like copper and nickel. So they probably are affecting the trees, but probably you would need just a more in-depth study just on that, which I know there are some studies within ELCARE looking at that. And we didn't actually do tissue samples on how the metals impact the trees, but we did look at bioavailable metals within the soils under the trees. But again, we just didn't find any consistent results among treatments. So I think you would just need more samples and do more samples per location to try to read out some of the variability that we found.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks a lot. Good presentation.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Robyn. Just appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. It's a delayed congratulations, but congratulations nonetheless. So we're going to move on now to the 2020 Bursary Award winner. We'll be hearing from Jonathan Levine, winner of the 2020 Tom Peters Student Bursary. Jonathan is currently a first-year PhD student in boreal ecology program at Laurentian University, and his research primarily focuses on introduction of novel reclamation strategies, i.e. pulp and paper waste, used to improve soil fertility in mining impacted areas. He earned a Master's of Science in Biology degree with the NSERC-funded LCARE project, where he investigated the influence of microscale soil conditions and topography on a species-rich planting regime's outcome. This research was part of a push from the City of Greater Sudbury's regreening program to increase the survival rate and growth of their species richness planting regime in degraded smelter-impacted upland environments. He'll be talking to us about constraints on northern aggregate pit reclamation and novel reclamation strategies for enhancing biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. Take it away, Jonathan.
Okay, so you can see my screen without it being full screen right now?
Yes.
Okay, now can you see my full screen presentation?
Yeah, you're good to go.
Okay, perfect. Give me 1 second here. Okay. All right, so good day, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Adam. Yeah, as you said, my name's Jonathan Levine. I'm a PhD student with Laurentian University's Boreal Ecology program, and I'm supervised by Dr. Nathan Basilico and Dr. Peter Beckett. As you said, I'm the proud recipient of the 2020 Tom Peters Memorial Bursary, and I want to thank the committee again for selecting me. It made me very proud to get this award. So today I'm going to present my research proposal that introduces an underrepresented industry in Northern Ontario land reclamation, as well as novel targeted rehabilitation strategies for northern climates. So when I think of mining and Canadian land reclamation, I think of my hometown, Sudbury, Ontario. I'm sure all of you here are familiar with its history, a century of economic boom, and as well as a century of ecological devastation, followed by 40 years of land reclamation efforts. So having earned my bachelor's, my master's of science degree from Laurentian University, the potential environmental effects of sulfide-bearing mineral mining is kind of ingrained in us from the beginning. So it's taught to us throughout our education there. And it wasn't until I accepted a PhD position, again at Laurentian, that I became aware of the ubiquitous presence of the aggregate mining sector and the obstacles it faces to successful rehabilitation in northern climates. So today I'm going to introduce a quick overview of the aggregate resource sector and current land rehabilitation strategies, the objectives of the study, and the overview of the many partnerships, as you can see here on the right-hand screen, that are being produced by this project, as well as a timeline of prospective work, because remember, this is a proposal, right? So we're at the early stages here, so it's going to be a lot of pictures and ideas so far. So nearly every community and nearly every industrialized or industrializing country is dependent on aggregate resources to build and maintain their infrastructure. So as you can see from a roadbed here, indeed, even agrarian communities depend on well-maintained transportation systems to move produce to markets. So for example, in Ontario, it takes 1,760 truckloads of aggregate to produce 1 kilometer of 4-lane highway. So you can see how important aggregate is to just maintaining and building Ontario's infrastructure. So aggregate production is the foundation of many construction supply chains as well. So with these products being the precursor materials for concrete, cement, and glass. And aggregate mining isn't going away anytime soon. In fact, global aggregate production is estimated to continue to increase approximately 6% every year as low-income countries continue to develop, reaching an annual value of $623 billion American by 2027. And here in this image here, we see a typical Ontarian aggregate mine. In fact, it's a local Sudburian mine operated by Etsy Sand and Gravel, one of our partners. And you can see here the loaders and the conveyors and crushers producing a variety of different aggregate products. So how many aggregate pits are currently in operation in Ontario? So as of 2020, we got 6,105 sites that are currently licensed or permitted under the recently modernized Aggregate Resources Act, which is the regulatory legislative body of the aggregate sector, which dictates its operations and regulates it and requires these really pretty complete closure plans as well. So, and that totals 1,815 square kilometers of land. In Sudbury, Ontario, where I'm from, we have 384 sites at nearly 210 square kilometers. And in Sault Ste. Marie, another northern town where I'm currently stationed right now, we have 171 sites and 48.2 square kilometers. So, a lot of square footage is being taken up by these aggregate sites. And additionally, there is an estimated 8,000 legacy sites throughout Ontario that are privately owned properties, which have a history of aggregate production, but were predated the Aggregate Resources Act once it was implemented in 1997. So, to put that in perspective, the Ontario's currently active aggregate footprint is nearly 2.5 times bigger than the 5 New York City. So it takes 2.5 or 2.3 New York cities to cover all of Ontario's land that's currently being used for aggregate purposes. So what is the contemporary practice for extracting and processing aggregates? So aggregate mining is typically a straightforward process with material being extracted in an open pit setting via excavation or blasting. However, before mining begins, any organic matter is stripped or removed and stockpiled to later be relayed once the operations are complete. While some materials require no processing, can be brought to market directly, most materials do need to be processed on site. So what are the environmental kind of setbacks of aggregate production? So fortunately, most environmental impacts associated with aggregate mining are relatively benign and immediate to the area that it's concerned with. So extracting aggregate, it seldom produces any acid mine drainage or other toxic effects commonly associated with mining of metallic or energy resources. So most of the impacts are likely to occur are short-lived, they're easy to predict, they're easy to observe, and by employing responsible operational practices and using available technology, most impacts can be controlled, mitigated, or kept at tolerable levels and be restricted to the immediate vicinity of the aggregate operation. As a contrast, however, many mines do directly influence the local hydrology of an area, which typically manifests in pit lakes. You often see like gravel pit lake road or something like that at the back end of your town or something like that. And these disturb the downstream processes in the meantime as the new system stabilizes. And additionally, the socioeconomic factors associated with aggregate mining, such as dust production and noise and habitat loss, are probably its most commonly associated concern that are brought up the most. And to help mitigate any socioeconomic or biological stress, the aggregate sector is one of the most heavily regulated industries in the province and subject to many federal, provincial, and municipal laws. So I've mentioned legacy sites a couple slides ago, but what are they? What do I mean when I say that? And why are they called legacy sites? So these legacy aggregate mines or properties are privately owned properties that all predate the Aggregate Resource Act of 1997 and never held a license or a permit. They may be abandoned or under ownership that have no closure or rehabilitation plans, or don't have the finances to rehabilitate lands in a timely manner. And as for why they're called legacy sites, these mines, they were intrinsic to building Ontario's infrastructure, and we wouldn't be here today as a developed nation without them. And fortunately, the ARA, the Aggregate Resource Act, has provisions to rehabilitate these legacy sites. So the aggregate sector is levied by volume of material extracted, so with 6 cents per ton being directed to a rehabilitation fund known as the Aggregate Resources Trust. And this trust funds the management of abandoned aggregate properties, or the MAP program right here. And both of these are maintained administratively by the Ontario Aggregate Resource Corporation, or TORC, right? Some of you may be familiar with TORC. And through TORC, they've rehabilitated hundreds of privately owned properties since 1997 on an entirely volunteer basis. So you submit your tender, and you gotta ask Torque to fix your problem if you want it to be fixed, or reclaim your land. So how are legacy sites rehabilitated currently? So most terrestrial, I'm going to focus on the terrestrials for this presentation, are backfilled at an appropriate slope ratio, usually 3:1 or 5:1. The flatter the better. And then they're topped off with the surrounding remnant topsoil, and then hydroseeded with native grasses or legumes, and then it's deemed a safe site. It's quite common for rehabilitated sites to be converted to agricultural or pastoral lands in order to become productive for the property owner. And rehabilitated sites have mostly been in Southern Ontario, as Northern Ontario was only incorporated into the MAP program in 2017. So also Torque is very academically active. On the bottom right here, we see Torque's 2019 forest floor transplant trials when they worked with, they're currently working with the University of Waterloo. And their most recent partnership is with us, Laurentian University, and our local Francophone college, Collège Boréal. And I'll speak more to these partnerships in a few slides. So what are the current rehabilitation strategies, and why do they struggle in, why do these current rehabilitation strategies struggle in northern climates? So in contrast to modern sites, the organic material of legacy sites have typically been degraded past any use. They've been recolonized, or they've just been lost to time. But nevertheless, any remnant organic material that they can find is typically reapplied on the site, respread, when possible to aid in rehabilitation. So it's worth noting that topsoil is never imported during these reclamation plants. However, as some of you may know, in Northern Ontario, organic matter is naturally thinner, and it can be therefore difficult to come by if even a portion of it is lost. And when you combine that lack of organic matter with the coarse textured, glacial till soils that we have here in the north, as well as its harsh climate, we can begin understanding why current strategies are struggling here. So just as a quick example here, we see a site in north of Greater Sudbury. The area here was backfilled at a ratio of 3:1 and then hydroseeded, with any remaining remnant organic soil put back down. And here on the right here is the outcome nearly 20 years later in 2014. And while it's now considered a safe site, vegetation organics are pretty sparse, as you can see from the image, with little natural infill happening. So I think that brings us fairly naturally to the first objective of this study, which is determining the main limiting factors to successful northern aggregate pit reclamation. And because these are unique soils that have a history of industrial use, they can be both compacted, coarse textured, and lacking soil organic matter all at once within one site. And additionally, Northern Ontario has a very harsh climate. It's got long, cold winters and short, dry summers. And this, coupled with these exposed soils, worsen drought periods where plants would otherwise survive. So knowing this, characterizing the main limiting factors to successful northern reclamation is imperative before moving forward with any rehabilitation operations. So while the details have yet to be ironed out, we're still planning on surveying we are planning on surveying the physical chemical properties of soil, as well as doing a survey on site topography and surveying plant, microbial, and fungal communities of approximately 6 sites. That's what we have in mind right now. And these aspects that I just mentioned are very good indicators of overall soil health. And as you'll see in a couple of slides here, it'll be interesting to see how these communities change over time. So what are we proposing to improve current strategies to target northern pit sites? We're proposing a pulp and paper mill waste blend as an alternative soil organic matter proxy, combined with a community engineering revegetation approach. Here we see OMAFRA here, laying down pulp mill waste on an agricultural land. And I added this image because it kind of gives us an idea of what our study site will look in the future. So now if we were to look in the future and have successfully identified the main constraints to growth here, we would need to develop a pulp waste blend that would overcome these constraints optimally. But what is pulp and paper waste? I wasn't very aware of it prior to my PhD, and I assume some of you may need to have a bit of an introduction to it. So how do we go from tree or wood to pulp, and what waste is generated along the way? So essentially what a pulp mill wants to do is separate cellulose from lignin, and that produces pulp as well as a large volume of reject material. So the reject is here, and then the pulp, unprocessed pulp called brown stock is here. And that unprocessed pulp requires multiple stages of washing and bleaching, clarifying, and general processing before it can be made into paper. And that requires an enormous amount of water to do that. For every, the estimate is for every ton of pulp processed, 25 tons of water are used, or 25 units of equivalent units of water are used, and requires active treatment. And this treatment process generates the two waste products that we're interested in reclamation. So from the clarifiers here, we have our primary sludge, whereas the solids settle out of the clarifiers, we get this primary sludge here. And our secondary sludge is generated as a result of the biological wastewater treatment that contains mainly that bacterial biomass. So primary sludge on its own can significantly improve the physical properties of soil. However, its carbon nitrogen ratio is pretty high. It's too high. It's around 50 to 1. And it typically requires some composting and nitrogen addition before it can be laid down. But amended primary sludge has been successfully used as a soil amendment in the past, many times, especially in agricultural or silvicultural industries, as well as capping material during mine closure programs. And secondary sludge, in contrast, it contains notable concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus as they're added to that digest treatment and to spur biological activity. And then when the effluent gets washed out, that N and P gets brought with it. And this, as you can see, is a lot more of a sludge, like traditional sludge-like material. So it has a CN of 5 to 1, and it's typically sprayed onto agricultural lands. So combining both sludge types is complementary, right? And it creates a material that improves both the physical and chemical characteristics of soil. The image on the right here is a sludge blend that's 1/3 primary sludge and 2/3 secondary sludge from a mill that we work with previous trials that we've done over the last 2 years. And as I said, these materials have a really strong history of success, especially in our own lab, as well as with local applications, Sudbury particularly as a mine capping tool. So while we have narrowed down the candidates for the foundation of our blend, we're still in the process of finalizing it. So luckily for us, one of our main partners, Collège Boréal, has a modern greenhouse facility. It's top of the line, which is going to allow us to produce these rapid turnaround experiments looking at vegetation response to a variety of possible amendment combinations. So may that be incorporating local compost or municipal biosolids, or even mycelium or microbial inoculations. So we'll be looking at that over the summer and then the spring and fall. So, and now finally to our last objective. So imagine a sludge blend has been finalized, or blends. We might be putting more than one down. And they've been approved by the government for application. It's now time to begin tracking environmental response here. So we're going to start off with that community engineering tool that I mentioned earlier. So this tool is being developed by the Great Lakes Forestry Center here in Sault Ste. Marie, where I'm located right now. And it focuses on establishing early forests specific to Sudbury's industrially damaged coarse texture soils. But the cool thing about it is that it uses the functional traits of 108 regional tree, shrub, and understory species. And using that, the tool can target and encourage the following characteristics here of your environment at any rate that you want. So, it can encourage rapid development, or rapid establishment of plants, soil building and health, and resistance to invasion and climate change. So if you want to only focus on 2 out of 5, you can select a plant community model that only selects 2 out of 5, or if you want to try to get all of them at once, and it spits out this species community mix that you should use to better target what you want. And luckily for us, we may be the first practical application of this model in a field setting. So we look forward to continuing to work with GLFC on this. So as per the community generated by the model and whatever other potential species we want to manually include, our revegetation approach is going to be to immediately colonize a sludge blend as quickly as possible, while having species that fill each trophic level of an early forest in order to prevent that erosion, right? Because we're going to be putting a good amount of material on the ground, and not just a powder, but a nice, at least like 5 to 10 centimeters. So, and a lot of these sites are quite sloped, so we want to really have our plants keep that in place. So that means not relying entirely on seedlings, but incorporating understory species through vegetation mats and potentially collecting early colonizer seeds from species like poplar or birch or maple and laying that down manually. So therefore, we need a multi-pronged tracking system, not only looking at seedling outcome, right? We got to track percent cover change, change in species richness and stuff like that. And luckily, soils on the other hand are a lot more straightforward. You just simply replicate the sampling effort done in pre-application settings to see how the pulp waste has changed the soils over time. And this is our preliminary prediction, which is essentially that a pulp mill waste and community engineering approach is going to kickstart ecosystem processes that were previously enacted in these pit sites. So here's a quick timeline of upcoming work. For the upcoming field season, as soon as the snow is melting right now, we're going to start characterizing and identifying our target sites, and then hopefully we have enough time to apply the waste for the fall, to get at least a full winter and some spring of the material settling in. And the next spring, we'll apply our vegetation and then track plant and soil parameters in a spring, summer, fall interval, essentially until we run out of money. So hopefully by the third or fourth growing season, environmental response is clear, and we can begin recommendations for future aggregate reclamation trials. So how's this all going to come together? As we saw in the introductory slide, this project has continued and brought about several key partnerships. On the left here, we have our industrial partners. I'm only going to name two here. So we have Glencore, one of the largest hard rock mining companies in Sudbury, and they've been interested in rehabilitating their own aggregate pits. So aggregate resources are essential to build and maintain their own infrastructure, as well as other mine-specific operations, by using novel northern-based strategies. As well as the University of Toronto run Pulp and Paper Consortium. So the consortium is essentially a group of pulp and paper companies that fund relevant industrial and applied pulp mill research, and has been a vital partner to us in the past and in the future for our land reclamation work. And on the right here, we have our governmental and academic partners. So Collège Boréal, which I mentioned earlier, is a local francophone college that our lab has partnered with a bunch of times in the past, for the past few years. And they have an exceptional, really forward-thinking and progressive applied research branch that specializes in silviculture and land reclamation, as well as these novel soil amendment types. So it's a perfect fit and a perfect partner for us. They take care of the applied side, and as for Laurentian, I take care of the more of the theoretical side. And last but not least here is Torque, our main partner that started this process, and that is a leader in rehabilitating aggregate pit sites for the past 20 years. And we thank them for their continued support and look forward to continued cooperation with this project. So to end, I'll leave you here with three potential implications of this project for broader land reclamation. And I want to thank Adam for hosting this, and thanking the committee again for giving me that, for awarding me that bursary. And I look forward to, in a year or two, giving you guys some preliminary response to the pulp waste that's been applied. And please feel free to ask your questions in the chat like we did with Robyn. And if you want to talk to me just to discuss further, you can email me at jleving1@laurentian.ca, or I'm on LinkedIn, so you can message me there. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jonathan. So we'll have a few minutes again for questions for Jonathan. Just raise your hand. I've got it figured out now, and I'll be able to unmute you so that you can ask your question. Oh, we can't let you get off that easy, Jonathan.
No, I hope there's questions. I like talking about this stuff.
Christopher, you should be able to come off mute and ask your question.
Hey, thank you for an excellent presentation.
Thank you, Chris.
My question I have for you at this point is, in your test plots, you're looking mostly at plant yield and species diversity, are you also examining the species and biology at the interface where you're applying, like underneath the sludges?
So you're kind of talking about how, like, what root growth is going to be into that material. Is that what you mean? Like how
from the plant side, and then also from the like, say, insects or micro.
Yeah. So in terms of the root growth stuff, or the plant side, not explicitly, but it's it's pretty easy to condemn a few of the seedlings or a few of the mats and check how the roots have been penetrating. And as for the microbial and the fungal aspects, yeah, definitely. So we're going to be characterizing the communities in a pre-application setting, and then seeing how the communities change and what's being imported with the material. So a lot of these materials come with their own suite of fungal communities and microbial communities. And some of our low volume plots that when we use this type of material out in the Sudbury kind of barren hills, the material brought with it a bunch of rot fungi. So it was starting to, in Robyn's presentation, you saw all this petrified wood that wasn't being decomposed. The material brought with it fungus that started literally decomposing the material like within days. Like, I'm sure if we put a can, you could see it starting to break down. It was quite amazing. So yeah, we'll be looking at how those aspects are being influenced.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for the great question.
Brian, I see you had a question. Do you want me to read it out, or do you want to ask it to Jonathan?
I'm reading it right now. So
okay.
Yeah. So on the availability of paper mill biosolids, we have a partnership through the consortium with a bunch of paper mills. Currently, we I don't know if I can name them. I've been told in the past that you got to get express permission before talking about them. But as for availability, I don't think that'll be an issue. Yeah, and as dioxins and issues like that, and like pharmacology issues. Yeah, we have a lot of essentially like broad spectrum tests that looked at the most common dioxide and pharmacology or medications and stuff like that are in them. They are present. We're planning on doing some catchments or some lysimeters to catch any runoff and stuff like that. Because yeah, so pulp and paper mills have been pretty toxic to produce pretty toxic waste in the future. But I don't have the numbers on hand, but yeah, they're definitely present, and we'll be trying to catch some of that through runoff.
Thanks, Jonathan. I was just wondering as well, whether most of the paper mills you're working with are Southern Ontario, and whether you have good enough, I'm assuming you're Southern Ontario, whether you have good enough overlap between your aggregate sites and paper mills in Northern Ontario, because in past history, in my experience, the transportation costs of bringing those biosolids on site is a project killer.
No, for sure. As you guys know, in Sudbury, just west of Sudbury, we have a pretty big paper mill, but they're not part of the consortium anymore. But we have one of our partner mills is just up Highway 144 in the Temiskaming region. So they're constantly bringing material up and down Highway 400 for like agricultural purposes anyway. So the logistics is already in place. But yeah, I understand that there's always a cost to any type of logistics, right? So, and it is worth considering.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Jonathan. Does anybody else have any questions for Jonathan before we move on? All right, seeing none, thanks for your presentation, Jonathan, and again, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you again for the award. It really means a lot to me.
No problem. So we are, unfortunately, we lost Veronika due to a internet outage by Rogers down in southern Ontario. But we are fortunate to have Kimberly Lyle, who is a environmental specialist up at the Detour site. She is going to step in and complete the presentation.
Yes, hello everybody. Is everybody able to hear me and to see my screen?
Yeah, we can.
Perfect. Okay, I can introduce myself very quickly, and also I have been in contact with Veronika. She does have self-service, just unfortunately no internet service, so she did want to apologize. It seems as though Rogers has done a wide outage in her area for some maintenance, so she was unable to get back online. I'm not quite as good as Veronika, but I will do my best. She is an excellent scientist and professional, and has been a huge role model and mentor for me. So I will try my best to finish off her presentation. So if I remember correctly, she was just finishing talking about the types of species that we were trialing on the MRS1 test cover area. So the native grasses and deciduous trees, as she was mentioning, were performing the best, including, as you can see in the photos there, these are the tamarack. I believe these here are poplar species, the wild willow, the raspberry. We didn't see as much success with our coniferous species. Part of that could be due to, this area is a little bit drier. There's not as much organic matter in the area. For the species that we were trialing. The overburden also tends to be a little bit basic pH-wise, which doesn't necessarily make for the greatest environment for the coniferous species of that area. So yes, we are seeing more success with the deciduous trees. And one of the things that we trialed as well for the test area was decompaction after the soil has been placed. So when you're working with this type of material, it can get extremely hard, extremely compacted, especially if you're driving over it up and down with equipment trying to place it. So once the material's been placed, we did trial out various methods of decompacting the material. And this did actually contribute to the success, especially for some of our native grasses. The seeds were able to establish better. They were able to kind of get into the nooks and crannies of the microtopography that we were creating with the decompaction. And then we also saw greater success with seed brain colonizing the area in the spots that we did have those sort of decompaction trials. So we can see that kind of in the photo in the bottom corner. Some of those species that are growing there were broadcast by our team, but other species that are in that photo, they did colonize naturally from the seed brain from the area. Another major project that we have going on right now is our tailings revegetation trial. As Veronika mentioned early in the presentation, we do have 2 tailings cells that will be decommissioned during the life of mine. So they will be available for reclamation while the mine is still active. So we need to be able to confidently reclaim these cells while the mine is still active. So we established these trials in 2019. The methods that we used were sort of a mesocosm method. So what we did was we acquired these sort of large tubs. Actually, they were watering tubs for livestock is what we ended up going with, just for the durability. And we filled them with the oldest and driest beech tails that we could find in our first tailing cell. And then what we did was we trialed different combinations of amendments to see how that affected the plant growth. So the amendments we trialed were overburden, peat, fertilizer, and biosolids, as well as the combination of those 4. So our early results are supporting that direct revegetation of the tailings is possible with the help of an organic amendment. So for example, in the bottom photo on this slide, that is just 1 growing season with peat and fertilizer added to the top of those beech tails. So we did see a lot of success and consistent success in our replicates as well. However, just the overburden addition to the amendment actually did not perform as well, which we were a little bit surprised about given the success we were having in just reclaiming with overburden on some of our other sites. But one of the reasons why we think that overburden may not be performing as well when it comes to tailings reclamation is because the overburden itself is also got a bit higher of a clay fraction. So as I was mentioning earlier, it can compact. And we see that as well with the tailings. Once it dries out, it can be quite compact. It's not, loose and airy like what you see with organic material. So that's just a mechanical block for the vegetation trying to establish. So we did have more success when we used an organic amendment on its own, with the help as well with some fertilizer, just because it added that texture that was required for the vegetation to be able to establish. So we sort of saw the same thing again with the tailings revegetation trial as we did with our rock stockpile reclamation trial. So our native grasses and our deciduous trees and shrubs are performing very well, but we do see a high mortality of conifers. And again, part of that reason could be because the organic material is a little bit lower, and as well with the tailings, they do tend to be on the more basic side when it comes to pH. So it's not necessarily the perfect environment for our conifer species right out the gate. It is a more suitable environment for our native grasses and deciduous trees at the start. In 2019, we did then start to get mine areas that were completed and they were available for restoration. So one thing we don't want to do on an active mine site is reclaim an area just to have it kind of overprinted again by the mining activity. But starting in 2019, the lower benches, especially of our rock stockpiles, got completed. So these are areas that will no longer be visited. They won't be dumped upon with other layers of rock. They're done for the life of mine. So now they're available for reclamation. So we've taken all of these past years of research and study, and we applied the results that we were seeing to this first 20 hectares. So we completed this first 20 hectares of progressive reclamation in 2020. So in this sort of area that you can see in the photo outlined in red, that was the area that we completed in 2020. And then in combination with the MRS1 test cover trial, which you can kind of see in the northwest corner of the photo, we have over 60,000 trees planted and now 20 hectares reclaimed on the mine site. And with this, we've also been able to now incorporate progressive reclamation into our life of mine plan as an annual activity. So we're working very closely with other departments across the mine site to be able to schedule areas that, everybody can confirm, yes, these areas will be ready to go for reclamation. And then we can plan to have that annual progressive reclamation as these areas become available. So we are ramping up to average 75 hectares per year. And the majority of terrestrial reclamation will be completed before mine closure, which is extremely beneficial as you can start to develop your reclamation areas. You can see, again, what's working, what isn't working, and create that extremely robust reclamation plan so that when you come closer to mine closure, you can leave the land as much, back to the natural area as you possibly can without scrambling to try to figure out a plan for a huge span of land that you haven't touched. So it's an extremely useful program, and we've got a lot of information from this, and now we are applying this to actual reclamation that will be consistent each year as the mine continues. And we are fortunate as well. We have an abundance of strips, till, and peat that we can use for covers. But the one thing we kind of do have a shortage of, or is a limiting factor for us, is the availability of native plants. So what we've started on the mine site is our native seed program. So native plant species are not really available commercially at the scale that we require right now. So what we're doing is we're planning for and building a seed bank. It's extremely critical to make sure that we stay on track for our progressive reclamation program. For Detour Lake Mine, most of the species right now that we're harvesting for our native seed program are deciduous, and our conifers are being sourced from neighboring seed zones in Quebec. The other advantage that we have to establishing our own native seed program and our own native seed bank is that you do get, differences in the seeds that you collect depending on the seed zone that you're in. So, the poplar and trembling aspen seeds that we're collecting in our seed zone will typically perform a little bit better than those seeds that are collected in a more southern seed zone, or one that's not in the area, just because these species are already sort of adapted to living in the exact climate that we're in. So this is our current seed bank that we have right now for the Detour Lake Mine. So, as I mentioned earlier, most of what we've been collecting have been our deciduous species. And so we have started to get this scheduled in terms of how many stems per year we're targeting based on what we project to be available for progressive reclamation. And then we've also tried to schedule as well when we will need to replenish our seed bank. So as you can see in the second last column, the next seed collection year. So that's when we've sort of planned, okay, we might run out of what we have in our seed bank, or we might need to replenish. So this is when we need to plan next to do another round of seed collection. And then we've also started to narrow down as well the seed collection period. In our early days of our native seed program and our native seed collection, we actually had to kind of adjust our seed collection period because we were finding, based on general knowledge of Ontario, we were actually, the ripeness of the seed in around the Detour Lake mine was much later than what was originally projected. So that was incredibly important to document as well, because when we were expecting the seed to be ripe, it actually wasn't. So we really had to keep very close attention to the seed, especially in the first year of this program. I was out checking our trees that were developing seed almost every day, because it was really a short window for when the seed became ripe and available for harvesting. And we were kind of shooting in the dark a little bit for when it was going to be ready, because it just did not seem to be following some of the standard timelines that were available to us. So in summary, the closure planning is, oh, apologies, did I just stop sharing my screen?
No, you're still good.
Oh, okay, perfect. Sorry, my window just shifted a bit. But anyways, in summary, so the closure planning and execution is a collaborative process that takes a few years to build up. There's many players involved, especially at the Detour Lake mine, research institutions, other even internally, other departments that are involved. It's not just the environment department. But it really, the progressive reclamation and our research programs are refining our methodology over time, and it's decreasing our uncertainty. So it's providing us with an extremely robust program that we will be able to use going forward in the future, and making sure that our reclamation programs are successful, the first time that we execute. It's also creating extremely positive opportunities to engage with our local Indigenous communities. This includes things like education and business development, especially when it comes to our native seed collection program, being able to establish this type of engagement with our Indigenous communities, not only for the native seed reclamation, but also for the growth of the species as well. Having that partnership with our Indigenous communities and having it collected and grown right within our communities. And then our early research and reclamation results are extremely encouraging as well. So our overburden, as we had kind of discussed before, it's really a suitable substrate for our mine rock coverage, but our placement method is extremely key with our decompaction methods. This is not a type of material that you'll be able to just place and pack down in seed. We do have to be strategic about how it's placed and decompacted. And then on the flip side of that, for tailings revegetation, we do have to take a different approach, and it appears that just a straight organic amendment, our peat, is more suitable than the overburden in terms of being able to get plants to establish. So these are all the types of things that we learn in our early research to be able to apply to our progressive reclamation program. And these long-term results are extremely critical for understanding not only the stability of the program, but also for overall costing, being able to prepare for exactly what our progressive reclamation is going to cost, so that there are no surprises and that there's nothing that we have to go back and redo, which is not only costly dollar-wise, but also time and labor. So all of this is contributing to our program.
Perfect. Thanks, Kim. Are you comfortable if we put you on the spot for some questions if anybody has some?
Yeah, that's no problem. I will do my best.
Perfect. Does anybody have a question for Kim? Oh, you might get off easy. Okay. Well, you know what? In that case, we are going to let you off easy. I just want to, Kim, thank you for stepping in at the last minute. I know it's tough sometimes being put on the spot. And on behalf of the Ontario chapter, congratulations again on this great project. It's definitely well well deserving of this award. So,
oh, thank you very much. Yeah, we're incredibly honored as well, and very excited about our program.
yeah, it's quite amazing. So this brings to the end. We did originally have planned a membership meeting for the end of this. We obviously, the inaugural webinar, we've learned some lessons along the way. So in talking with a couple of my executive members, we're going to mothball the members meeting. There were a couple of things that I think are important that I want to touch on, that we're going to talk about. Again, memberships, please, buy your membership. It's very important to us. It provides us with some capital to be able to run these things and come up with other initiatives. Some of the upcoming initiatives, new membership drive. We really want to drive up our numbers, the number of members we have within the association. So there'll be some emails and whatnot coming out regarding that. We're also, as a board, we're going to develop a strategic plan, and I think it'd be a benefit to have some of our members part of that process. We are putting together a webinar series, this one being the first of it. But if you have any input on topics, or if you'd like to be a presenter, please reach out to us. Emails are on the CLRA Ontario website. And we're also going to be doing a website update, just to update some of the information on there. So on behalf of the board of directors, I just want to thank everybody. Thank you to the presenters again for taking the time to present your projects to us. And again, congratulations on your awards. I just want to thank all the attendees for participating as well. And I hope that everybody has a good day.